Now, our last speaker is Adrian Griffin, Managing Director of Lithium Australia.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks for coming along. Great pleasure to speak at this conference, and I try to get here every year to do so. What I want to do today is something a little bit different, I guess. We've got a fairly diverse company, and we've focused over the years on completing the circular economy in all sectors of the battery industry. So we have a raw materials division, chemical division, a battery division, and then at the end of life, we pick those things up and recycle them through a number of commercial plants that we have located in Victoria. Most of the raw material division we have farmed out, and we hold equity in the companies that are running the projects and free carried interest. So keep an eye on Galan Lithium and Charger Metals. They're really up to big things. But today I'm going to talk primarily about the batteries. So I'll take you through what the cost components are, the price pinching points, and really today we sit in unusual circumstances, to say the least, and we have to take into account the commodity price increases and how they affect our business and everyone else's business, the supply chain itself and how you secure that, political intervention, the alternative supply chain, because we don't have to keep doing what we're doing, and then into what we do best, and that is homegrown lithium ferrophosphate, the best lithium ferrophosphate on the planet. So what was Bloomberg's view of a lithium-ion battery in 2021? You can see there the cost of the cathode was about half of it, and then the other bits and pieces, much more controllable in terms of cost. And then if you have a look at the weighted average price or cost of a battery pack or cell, you'll notice those have been decreasing very, very rapidly. But this contains statistics from all types of batteries. So that's NCM, NCA. When I say NCM, 611, 622, the 90 series, so on and so forth. But what you do see is LFP during that period of time actually broke through the $100 a kilowatt hour. Now, at this stage, so you don't fall asleep, I want you to stretch your legs and be upstanding, please, in acknowledgement of those people fighting for democracy in the Ukraine. And that's having a big impact on our industry. Thank you very much. So what are the impacts? Well, we've seen some strange things happen in the markets over the last couple of months. There is the invasion of the Ukraine, of course, the financial sanctions that have been placed on Russia, widespread fixing of the nickel price, which is a really interesting thing that caused the closure of the LME, of course, and Beijing stepping in to try and control lithium prices. One wonders what they're going to do. And all this has happened just in the last 2 months. So I do have concerns about the long-term lithium price and Chinese influence over that price, and just hope like hell they're not going to do to the lithium industry what they did to the rare earths industry a couple of years ago. So what are the pinch points on the commodities that go into lithium-ion batteries? There's the nickel price, steady rise for a long period of time, and then around about the beginning of March, sitting at $11. Invasion of the Ukraine, off comes production, availability of production to the Western world from Norilsk, and that's about 10% of the nickel market, of course, and a fair bit of the cobalt market. And the price spiked on official trades that were honoured at $21, but what history will fail to show, because the contracts were reversed, there was actually short selling up to $50. The LME closed, of course, on 2 occasions. We're back down to around 15, but at 15 the price has doubled over a very short period of time. Cobalt, over that period of time that nickel went through the roof, cobalt went up by about 20%, and over the long term it has more than doubled. Lithium carbonate prices, of course, up over the last 12 months by 550%. It's just an amazing market. So what does this do to the inputs to the battery industry? I have here a chart that was produced by Roskill up to 2019. But if we go back to 2019 and assume that the inputs have doubled, and you take NCM 811, which is 8 parts nickel, 1 part cobalt, 1 part manganese, if you double those inputs, that's what you end up seeing. If you double the inputs on lithium ferrophosphate, LFP, the difference is very small indeed. And in fact, if we quantify those numbers on a battery pack containing NCM 811, we see the inputs just in the cathode side, so this is not the whole battery pack, just the cathode side, of around about $1,000. And if we quantify what goes into the LFP pack to drive the same capacity vehicle, the increase has only been $250. So what does that mean? It means LFP really is a hedge against the commodity price. So this is absolutely critical to the battery storage industry and the EV industry, and certainly producers are starting to see that as reality. To such an extent that every EV producer now, apart from GM, does provide an LFP option over all their entry models. But politics is also influencing the industry. And if we have a look at what the United States have done, June last year, they implemented the Biden battery blueprint, which really says if you're going to produce batteries in the United States, you have to do it through a domestic supply chain. March of this year, we saw the inaugural Australian-US Strategic Commercial Dialogue, and what that is designed to do is free up the federal-controlled funding agencies in the United States and allow them to invest in the Australian industry, and in particular the battery industry. And then earlier this month, only a few days ago, Biden dusted off a bit of Cold War infrastructure, being the Defence Production Act, which will provide government funding back into mining and processing, not only in the United States, but probably here in Australia as well. So we are getting some drivers on the political front. The EU, bear in mind that I mentioned in the United States they're going to have to go for integrated supply chains that are all domestic. The EU will probably end up in the same position, but for different reasons. They've certainly put a lot of money into developing the battery industry, and I think they now command a fair proportion of that outside China. The United States, as far as their global participation goes, they're only about 10% in the industry. So the United States is not big on batteries, and that 10% to a large extent is the Tesla Gigafactory. So the EU putting a lot of money into the battery industry, a lot of money into the green economy, and they are developing a world first, and that's the carbon border tariff. Now, what that's going to do is effectively make products that aren't zero carbon footprint very difficult to move, not only inside Europe, but as imports into Europe. So if that policy gets to legislation, it's due to go to legislation in 2026, the days of moving spodumene from Western Australia to China, producing a lithium chemical, exporting that, going into Europe and producing a battery, those days are gone. You'll never be able to comply with the tax requirements or the carbon footprint requirements. So things are moving. There's a lot of political input into this. Where does Australia stand? Well, I guess we've heard this morning about a number of companies that have been beneficiaries of recent government policy here in various types of grants and loans. And of course, there's Pure Battery Technology that's teamed up with Poseidon to put in that battery precursor facility in Kalgoorlie. So the Australian government at long last is starting to do something, but they could certainly do a lot more, not only in the provision of various lines of finance, but also legislation to make sure that we get our industry supported. So what I do say about that supply chain as it exists at the moment, once we go to domestic supply chains more widely, some of these problems will disappear. But the supply chains at the moment, particularly with respect to NCM batteries or nickel and cobalt containing batteries, are very complicated. And the commodities that we put into those batteries literally do a couple of laps of the globe before they get to the consumer. That creates a huge carbon footprint. If, however, you drop the nickel and cobalt out of those batteries and you go for an LFP battery that only has lithium, iron and phosphorus, you can produce the cathode active materials close to the site of the source of lithium, for example, here in Western Australia, or to some extent, I guess the last speaker was talking about doing part of that in Africa. So if you do that, the availability of iron and phosphorus on a global basis is quite reliable, and you can source that locally. So you can get rid of a lot of the convoluted supply chain if you go to LFP. Much simpler logistics. Battery performance, critical issue. There we see the nickel and cobalt type batteries, and everything in this business is a bit of a compromise. The NCM 622, which is currently the most favoured battery in EVs in the Western world, certainly not in China, but in the Western world, you'll see that it has certain shortfalls with respect to thermal runaway, so the safety is not optimal, has high cost, and of course held to ransom by nickel and cobalt. The same can be said for all of the others, and removing cobalt reduces the stability and as a consequence reduces the safety of the battery, increases the thermal runaway. But battery producers have strived to get away from cobalt because of problems with child labour and the like in the Congo, where much of that cobalt originates from. Chinese, on the other hand, have been very focused on LFP, lithium ferrophosphate, and you'll notice there that it has optimal performances in just about every aspect apart from energy density, where the energy density is about 25% lower than the top-end nickel and cobalt batteries. But you can fix that problem, and I've got to say, in our facility where we produce cathode powder in Brisbane, we have produced LMFP, lithium manganese ferrophosphate, which just about restores all that energy density and retains all those other great properties of LFP. So what is the market opportunity for LFP? I guess simply speaking, getting away from nickel and cobalt is a really good idea. Keep the chemistry simple and produce a product that's much more reliable, much lower cost, as we saw from those early charts, and has supreme safety, and it's the cheapest product on the market. So the EV producers have come to the conclusion that this is the thing to do. And as I mentioned previously, they're all offering, apart from GM are playing around with their own nickel and cobalt battery chemistry, but apart from GM, every EV producer is providing an LFP option in their vehicles. And as a consequence, the demand is increasing enormously. And if you have a look at installed capacity in China, the committed installed capacity last year increased by 400%. And if you look at the top right-hand corner, as those plants get commissioned, we'll see year-on-year growth of LFP in China of 145%. Growth rates last year were 30% a month. It's just unbelievable. So the production of LFP now in China has actually surpassed the production of the so-called ternary type batteries, the nickel and cobalt batteries. The interesting thing about that is China now produces more than 99% of LFP. The market is growing so rapidly in China that none of it can get out of China. It all gets consumed by the expanding domestic market, and there's almost nothing left for anyone else that wants to produce an LFP battery outside of China. So the opportunity is there to supply that unserviced market with LFP cathode powders, which will ultimately have an insatiable demand. So we at Lithium Australia plan on commercialising LFP production using our patented, it's global patents, RC process, and we're targeting the emerging markets. And just go back a little bit, I did say that China produces 99% of this, so the emerging markets are really any country outside China. That includes South Korea, by the way, and Japan. Oh, interesting statement. That's credited to me in March 2022. In fact, I'll say it again and make that April 2022. So the RC process, what does that offer the market? Certainly offers a cost advantage. What we did was look at all the processes around the world producing LFP materials, figured out where all the weak points were, started from scratch, designed a new flow sheet, took out as many process steps as we possibly could, and we ended up with what was probably the most simple nanotechnology available to man. So less process steps, much simpler, easier to control, produces cathode powders. We test, incidentally, at the moment in commercial battery plants around the world. We're currently testing in 8 countries, and we test against everything that's available that comes out of the Chinese market, and I can confidently say that just about on every performance spec, we exceed anything else that is available to an ultimate consumer. So good specifications, consistent quality, and I think the quality is a consequence of simplifying the process. And ESG fundamentals, they're fantastic because this process is a single pass process and effectively zero discharge. So there's no solid waste and all of the water in the process gets recirculated. So what's the development path? That little plant that you saw on the last slide was our pilot facility in Wacol in Queensland. That's been operating now for 20 years. So this didn't happen overnight. The last 12 years have been dedicated almost entirely to LFP. So it is the most extensively pilot tested material on the planet, and we're ready for commercialisation. Path to commercialisation is very similar to just about any other process. And you go through pre-feasibility, which we've done, definitive feasibility, which we're well underway, and we made an announcement today that Lycopodium have been appointed to give us a hand with that. But we have come to the conclusion that probably the most demanding part of the commercialisation process is pre-qualification. So an EV producer, for example, can buy that cathode powder and they know it's exactly the same every time they buy it. The battery industry is plagued with recalls as a consequence of lack of quality control, despite the fact they have very stringent pre-qualification requirements. However, we will go through the pre-qualification process simultaneously with our DFS. So prior to completion of the DFS, we hope to have pre-qualification complete and then move on to produce what will probably be one of the first major LFP production facilities outside China, and that will be committing to the construction of a 10,000 tonne per annum cathode powder plant. So Lithium Australia, what's it all about? Apart from all those other complex business divisions that I mentioned, it's really about direct exposure for the investor, at least direct exposure to the LFP market, and it's the only direct exposure to the LFP market on the ASX. We've got a situation where the product that we produce has absolutely unprecedented growth in the current market. The users of LFP powder outside China simply can't get enough of it, and they're not expanding production at the moment because that's not available. We hope to change that situation. So we do that by providing a far superior product than anything else that's available. It's a mature product, so it's not something that was invented yesterday. It has taken 20 years in the nano powder field to get to this point, and 12 years, as I mentioned, dedicated to LFP. We do make a couple of other products, of course, LMFP that I mentioned, which is LFP on steroids, and we're covered by international patents. So we do have the freedom to operate on a global basis without infringing any of the existing patents, which in fact cause the current industry a lot of grief. We also have other patents that wrap our circular economy together, and they're also covered by international patents, and we have established ESG credentials, which will ultimately allow others, such as the battery producers, to benefit from our experience and the ability to take back that product at end of life and reprocess it and produce new lithium-ion batteries. So that takes care of sustainability in the battery industry. And if anyone's out there as a consumer that has spent batteries that they want to get rid of, come and see us because we can do that for you. We are the only fully permitted facility in Australia capable of handling lithium-ion batteries. That's Melbourne-based, 2 facilities, one at Campbellfield and one at Laverton. So that provides the end of life solution. I believe it's question time, but I'll start with the first question. That is Peter Harold in the audience? Yeah. I've got to talk to Peter about the grant that they got for the production of cathode precursors in Kalgoorlie. I think that's a great step forward. And one of the things they're looking at is taking material from spent batteries. And if you hark back to what I said, we are the only licensed facility in Australia capable of recycling those things. So there should be a good match there with Poseidon and Pure Battery Technologies, because they want to take spent batteries as part of that program. Thank you very much.